Hi, my name is John Kelly. It's a pleasure to speak with you today about the changing nature of proximity in the 21st century and how this can be understood through the lens of what I like to call cybersocial geography or cybersocial terrain. So my goal today is to introduce you to what I hope is kind of a fun concept of cybersocial terrain, which helps to explain how the 21st century technologies of communication are starting to really change fundamentally the nature of human life in certain interesting ways. So without further ado, the core concept here is that for thousands of years, human civilization has organized in geographic terrain. And as geographers, I know that's what you all study with a great deal of methodology developed over a long time. But if you think about kind of how humans evolved in geoterrain, all human collective activity, and all human activity really is collective activity, happens through the process of communication. And for thousands of years, communication was bound in space and time in ways that really mattered. And so, human communication for all those thousands of years, whether it was creating states or building empires or trading goods or anything from, raising families to warfare, happens through communication, which was at the speed of a horse or a boat or a runner at its very fastest. And the rise of the internet has created a kind of network society that has happens primarily, where human communication happens primarily in what we like to call here at Graphica, cybersocial terrain. And we think of this as the key domain now. So let me sort of unpack that a little bit. So my company Graphica is named in homage to this person, Eratosthenes, the head of the Great Library Museum of Alexandria, of which the library was a component back in the 3rd century BC. And in addition to that esteemed title, Eratosthenes is known as the father of geography by many for a book he wrote called Graphica, kind of translated with that Greek K. And that's where Graphica's name comes from. The book was founding essentially the field of geography, this idea that you could lay down a system of grid lines over a map of geoterrain in a way that was isomorphic with reality and could be, have high fidelity to that reality of geoterrain in ways that would let you draw borders and navigate and negotiate and levy taxes and all the kinds of things that early states wanted to do with mapping. And so at Graphica, we are dedicated to mapping out the cybersocial world, all the patterns of connections between people today. And so in homage to Eratosthenes, we named the company Graphica by chopping off the geo. And I'm going to explain a little bit more what I kind of mean by this concept in a sec. So we're accustomed to geographic maps, and what we're looking at here is a map of the world, and superimposed on this map are the telegraph lines from the Eastern Telegraph Company in 1910, crossing oceans and continents. And this represents a really interesting moment in time where, for all that kind of period of human history prior to this, communication was bound spatially. And all of a sudden, we were able to punch a wormhole through geographic terrain and communicate at planetary scale in real time. And even though nobody had this in their house except maybe Abraham Lincoln and Queen Victoria, it radically altered human civilization. The way that empires were run, the way armies were commanded, the way that trade was negotiated, the way that markets were organized, the way that transportation was organized, by being able to communicate, from London to Delhi and instantaneously, as opposed to sending a ship that had to sail for a month and a half to get there. It radically rewired human civilization in ways that happened through that kind of the back end of its large institutions that had access to this technology. So human life was fundamentally changed by that invention. And now this is another picture of the world that we live in. This is a really fun map from 2010 of Facebook friendship connections strapped onto a map of the world. And here, every little arc there is connecting two people because they're friends on Facebook. And what's interesting is that you see the shape of the world here, right? But the really interesting thing about communications in the 21st century is that all of these little connections, all these micro choices that people make about who to follow and what to like, create a fabric of communicative structure that has shape, it has structure, it has pockets of density and community around people that know each other and have come together online around things that they're interested in. And it doesn't actually look like this, meaning that this fabric has its own shape, which is not just kind of artificially strapped onto a geoterrain, but emerges from a kind of structural process of building networks through all of these little micro choices. What I mean by that, well, here's an example. These are 12 different language open web topologies. They could call them blogosphere maps. But so rather than social media, every dot here is a website, a weblog, something that's kind of on the open web. And what we're doing here, these are kind of social network diagrams, physics model layouts where between every website and every other, a citation between them kind of pulls the dots together as though, by a little spring or a force of gravity. And so what you're seeing is kind of the clustered community structure. You can see the pockets of density where these websites are deeply interconnected. And across these languages, you get different patterns. They look different because the structure emerges from kind of the sum total of all these individual choices that people are making. And therefore, these structures represent kind of the unique characteristics of these societies that speak these languages. So if you look at English in the upper left, you see kind of two big concentrations in the upper part of that map. Those are left-wing and right-wing American politics. If you look at Persian or kind of Farsi, what you see on the right is kind of the more religious side of that society. And on the left, the websites that kind of represent the more secular side of that society. And the top is cultural stuff, and the bottom is politics. So in the lower right, you've got kind of pro-Iranian government political clusters. In the lower left, you've got reformist kind of opposition to the government clusters. In the top left, you've got Farsi language love poetry that is kind of primarily referencing pre-Islamic poetic genres in ways that are more popular with one side of that society than the other. In the upper right, you've got other things which are cultural, mom blogs and those kinds of things, cultural life and sports and other things. So that represents something about what brings people together in communities in Iran. If you look at French, that kind of blob on the top is gourmet cooking. So the only point I'm really trying to make here is that the network structures of the fabric of these communications across societies matter, and they reflect how community forms and proximity between actors on the internet, kind of in cyberspace, ends up being a function of that community structure, which is formed by all these emergent decisions that people make. And what we call this structure is cybersocial terrain, because like GeoTerrain, it's a place where people interact, but it's not physical, it's cyber. And that's why we call it cybersocial terrain. And all human collective activity, everything happens through a process of social communication. And that's why if we think about how we communicate in the 21st century on these little devices we carry around in our pockets with our various social media presences and email lists and messenger applications and all that, that's where we are embedded in these complex 21st century societies. And what's really interesting to think about there, and I think is important to understand about what's so different about human life in the 21st century as compared to the 20th century, I want to boot up a concept of networks across social scale. So this is a diagram that represents this concept of social scale, and that kind of red larger than the others figure on the left there. That's ego. That's you, me. We're surrounded by our more or less 6 best friends, embedded in a kind of network of 30 highly trusted relationships, people you might allow to watch your kids for a night when you go out to see a show. And then as we move to the right, we move up through kind of larger and larger levels of social scale. So 150, that's sometimes called the Dunbar number, as a reference to Robin Dunbar, a Scottish paleoanthropologist or primatologist who has discovered that there's some very interesting properties, this number of 150, that relate to the fact that it's roughly the number of people that you can track reputationally. I may not want to leave my kids with them for the night, but I have a pretty good sense if I loan them $5, I'm going to get it back. A village with 151 people doesn't need needs a constable, but a village with 149 does not. From there, you move up to larger scale. The number 5,000 is roughly the number of faces you can put a name to, kind of actual specific human beings that you can sort of have knowledge of their existence, whether it's Brad Pitt or your mother. And then as you move up beyond that, you get into what is sometimes called imagined societies. Benedict Anderson coined that phrase, and it means the large structures or large social groups that we consider ourselves embedded within because of the way we were brought up, the stories we were told about who we are, what our values of our society are, kind of the history that we share. And so imagined communities, nation states, great religions, might be people that you would sacrifice your life to defend, even though you've never met. And that's pretty much an infinitely scalable number there. You can have imagined societies of hundreds of thousands or millions. And so across these layers of social scale, it used to be very different how people communicated. So you had, on the left side there, kind of at the interpersonal level, you had certain ways, methods of communication. And at the mass scale, you had different methods of communication. And that really changed from 20th century to 21st century. And it's really kind of fundamental to understanding why that's important. So if you think about how things were kind of in the up to and including the 20th century, on the micro side of social scale, you had certain technologies or of communication, or certain methods of communication. You could talk to people around a table. You could call them on a landline. You could write them a letter and put it in the mail. Then as you moved up to meso level, sort of thousands, tens of thousands, numbers of people, those meso levels of social scale, these were organizationally mediated, right? So you had formal organizations, political parties, social groups, professional societies. And these were structures that were required to be able to communicate at meso level. And these organizations typically had, authoritative and accountable leadership. They would have, bylaws. There would be certain bureaucratic structures for that communication. You had leadership that could say yes and say no to things. So a lot of properties at the meso level, organization mediated, that allowed some kind of control of these of communications at that scale. And then you move up to the macro side, kind of this whole of society, mass media methods of communication. You had television, you had the printing press, you had radio. These were methods of communication, big social microphones that required capital power or state power. And these things had editors, they had owners, they had gatekeepers that were able to control sort of the content that was distributed through the megaphones. And we think of that kind of era of mass media society as kind of, you can think of it as a human gate-kept or gatekeepered information economy, right? Information was rare, in a sense, and meant a lot. It's very valuable. When we move to the 21st century, things changed dramatically because we've got new methods of communication, and they can all be mediated through the internet. And these new methods of communication do not have these kinds of boundaries between what you do on the micro side, the meso side, and the macro side. The little phone you're carrying around in your pocket can connect you to your best friends, all the way up to communications relevant to the entire nation or group of nations, or in fact the entire all of humanity. So you get rid of these kind of distinctions, and now you've got kind of one way, cyber enabled, cyber social fabric that accounts for all social communication. And you get rid of the gatekeepers, so you dramatically reduce the power of gatekeepers at the macro side and at the meso side. And you now, instead of requiring formal organizations for meso scale communications, People can get together and do things and take social action, whether it's, doing a flash mob or creating a recruitment funnel for a terrorist organization, all without it means that do not require formal organization to sort of self-assemble these kinds of mesoscale collective actions. So we live in a very different society mediated by cyber social fabric, all these connections that happen in cyberspace resulting from the accumulation of all these micro choices. And all those micro choices create relationships and condition algorithms that determine the flow of information and influence in the 21st century in ways that in the cyber social fabric emerge from all those choices that you and others make. And so we no longer live in a human gate-kept information economy. We live in an algorithmic social attention economy where information is overwhelmingly plentiful, and what's scarce is not information, but human attention in this world where there's so many different little bleeping logos competing for your very scarce attention and eyeball time. And the interesting thing about the cyber social fabric is that it does have meaningful and measurable mappable structure. So just as one example, this is a network diagram of the Twitter network of Marvel fans. And so what I developed initially in my dissertation for as machine learning community detection in large scale weblog networks, now my company Graphica applies to all kinds of different online social networks for all kinds of different customers that are interested in understanding the communities online that sort of self-assemble and understanding how information travels within them and across them. And the example here, just kind of for fun, is Marvel fandom. So you've got not just Marvel fans, but in the in the cyber social terrain around Marvel fandom, you've got lots of different communities, from kind of the cosplay communities in the upper left, communities or clusters focused more on anime and internet humor down in the lower right, Naruto anime, DC comics, Avengers fans, all kinds of stuff. So in these large scale cyber social sort of pieces of cyber social fabric, you can really map them out, understand the relationship between these communities. The colors you see on the dots here, each one of which is a social account, those colors are from a machine learning algorithm that does the community detection and figures out what are the different pockets of people that are in closer social proximity online because they share certain interests, attitudes, and affiliations. And so, we have technology that allows us to map all this out and understand it. So just to kind of wrap up, it's here's sort of the way that we think about cyber social terrain and 21st century communications. We think of it as kind of a two-layered system in which on the bottom, you've got that cyber social terrain, that network of primarily social relationships that are built by all these choices that people make, that kind of emerge from those choices, all the pockets of density, the communities in that network. And that is fairly stable. So people change a bit in who they like and what, pages they have joined in Facebook or groups. And, all these little choices that people make on different platforms allow these communities to emerge and then to evolve. But they're fairly stable relationships that aren't, dramatically changing from day to day. They're kind of a long continental drift, if you will. But then there's a layer on top of that, which is all the communications that are transiting this terrain. And that is extremely complex and rich information flow. And so some of the technology that we develop and employ in our work is really interested in both of these layers. So what is that underlying kind of social layer, the networks and all the different communities, understanding the shape of that, but then understanding from all that message traffic that's flowing over it, how do these signals, bazillions of messages every day, how do some of those flock, if you will, through that network space? What are the genres of narratives or kind of genres of memes, the sort of, what's the correspondence between these flocks of ideas in the network space and the parts of that terrain that they're flocking through? If you think of a lot of the social media analytic tooling that you may have heard about, if you work in marketing or analyzing kind of online conversations, a lot of that capability is really only on this top layer here, and that those platforms typically kind of view all the social media activity as a kind of fire hose of content and time. And they're doing very 20th century stuff with that, which is not good. It's cool stuff, but they're kind of counting how many people are talking about hashtag X or this or that brand in that fire hose of content. And maybe some fancy NLP to say is most of that conversation happy or sad, sentiment analysis. But that's not qualitatively different than what rooms full of people were doing in World War II, reading German newspapers and coding them up. What we're really interested in is how does that activity happen across that network terrain? Because people don't live inside a fire hose of content. People live inside digital neighborhoods that they construct. And we're really interested in what's going on in the different digital neighborhoods. So anyway, that is my brief introduction to this concept of cybersocial terrain, that kind of fabric of connections among us, how we map and measure it, and how proximity in the 21st century is as much or more a function, proximity between humans as minds is more a function of that kind of proximity in the cybersocial fabric than it is a function of where you're, what your lat long is and kind of where you're situated physically. And with that, thank you for taking time out to listen to me. I hope it's been an interesting way to spend a few minutes of your time.